Well, hello, Fire Hall. Hope you enjoy your potluck after today's service. And hello, Warehouse. And of course, a big hello to all of you here at the factory. Also, a big hello to Churchill. We think of you, and we're so glad that you are able to use these teachings. If you're new here, my name is Carolyn. I'm the pastor of care and marriages here at Riverwood. And today we're launching back into chapter 11 of the story. This past June, my youngest daughter, Carly, graduated from high school. And as part of her graduation gift, I made her this photo book, a photo book of her life, and I called it Your Journey to Graduation. You know, that graduation that every kid anticipates, where school will be done and true life can begin. Well, I have to tell you, she's learning a little bit about that already. But you know what? I spent hours scouring our photo albums, both print and digital, looking for just the perfect pictures that would represent her life, those special moments, the people, the places, the events that marked her growing up years. From her arrival into our home to getting a dog that she, her sisters, and her dad begged for months. From that fun, crazy hair day in kindergarten to the beautiful hair at her grade 9 grad. From summer vacations at Rushing River to mission trips to Swaziland. From singing on this stage as a preschooler in Kids Zone to singing on this stage as a worship leader for Uprising. From a silly face to a pretty face, from a mouth filled with braces to a confident smile, from a flower girl dress to her graduation cap and gown. This is a book filled with snapshots of Carly to help tell a story of a journey through the first 18 years of her life. Now, you may not have realized it this week, but in a sense, you held a photo book in your hands as you read chapter 11 of the story. We saw the snapshots of somebody's journey, the highlight moments of a guy who was overlooked and forgotten as a kid, but who became the most famous, beloved king of Israel. It was a man named David. And today, let's look at his photo book, if you will, called The Journey from Shepherd Boy to King. Now, if you are visiting with us today, we are going through a chronological, abridged version of the Bible called The Story. And it takes the scripture and it highlights the moments, places, people, and events of the Bible to help us better understand God's story. And if you don't have a copy of the story, please feel free to pick a copy up at the Welcome Center, free of charge. Last week, Todd walked us through chapter 10, and we learned about 4 main characters: Hannah, Eli, Samuel, and King Saul. And as we time traveled over their stories, we discovered this, that Hannah was a woman who was misunderstood, but she remained faithful to God. Eli loved God, but he lacked conviction. Samuel accomplished much, but he never took any of the credit. Saul, the first king of Israel, he had so much potential, but he blew it because he made everything about himself. And God withdrew his blessing on Saul's role as a king. And now, in chapter 11, a guy named David enters the scene. And our photo book begins with a snapshot of the prophet Samuel, who, like I said, we were introduced to last week. And now I picture him as this silver-bearded, stately-looking man. And he's instructed by God to appoint a new king. And God tells him that he's going to find this new king in a place called Bethlehem, a small, obscure village about 12 kilometers outside of Jerusalem. Then it was an insignificant, tiny village. But as you know, it becomes one of the most famous cities in the world, a place of pilgrimage that Christians from all over go to. A city we visited while on our Riverwood tour to Israel just over a month ago. Well, with some reluctance, Samuel travels to Bethlehem, to the home of a man named Jesse. Jesse was the grandson of Ruth, and we heard about and read about Ruth a couple weeks ago. This new king would come from Jesse's family. Now, Samuel definitely had some anxiety about going. He questions God's instructions. You see, Israel still had a king, and the only one that knew that Saul would no longer be king was Samuel. And so Samuel has to now go and appoint a new king, and he says to God, are you kidding me? What if Saul finds out that I'm going to pick a new king? He will kill me. Well, Samuel wasn't the only one who had this anxiety. When the elders of the town saw him approaching, their hearts started pounding too. Their hands got sweaty. What is this big shot prophet coming to our little town for? It must mean something. It must mean that something is wrong, something is bad. Prophets don't show up in Bethlehem. So they ask Samuel, "Do you come in peace?" And he reassures them, "Yes, I do. I've just come to offer a sacrifice to God. Come along with me." And he invites Jesse and his 7 sons to join them as well. So Jesse and his boys get all cleaned up, and they go with Samuel to make the sacrifice to God and to have this feast. And when they show up, Samuel notices the oldest son right away. His name is Eliab. And Samuel thinks, "Oh, this is great. My job of appointing the king is done. Look at that guy. He's amazing. He's sharp. He is king material. That must be the one." And God says, "Nope, that's not the one." And we read about it in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, and it's page 145 of the story. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." God wasn't going after a king who looked the part. He was going to go after a king with character. Because you know what? Character always trumps looks. So Samuel goes on to son number 2. His name is Abinadab. Doesn't that sound like a great name for a king? Abinadab. This guy, he must be the one. God says, "Nope, he's not the one." And the same thing happens with son number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, and the procession comes to a halt. God has said no to every single one. He's held up that red flag. That isn't the one. And Samuel gets a little confused, but I know I'm in the right place. What is going on here? And he says to Jesse, "Do you have any more sons?" "Oh yeah, I have one more. The youngest, he's in the back 40 looking after the sheep." And Samuel says, "Well, go get him. Bring him here. We are not starting this feast until he gets here." So someone goes and gets David and walks him in. David saunters in, this 15-year-old, smelly, but cute shepherd boy. And much to everyone's surprise, God says, that's the one. Jesse must have looked at his youngest, maybe pimply-faced teenager. When he says youngest, the Hebrew word there is actually meaning runt. He's calling this kid, he's the runt of the litter. And Samuel wants to choose him. You see, God saw something different in David, different than his father saw, different than his brothers saw. What was so special about this kid? God saw in this kid a guy who would have a heart after him, a guy who would be one that had integrity, a guy that we would come to know as intensely selfless and intensely missional. 1 Samuel 16:13 says, so Samuel took the horn of oil and he anointed him in the presence of his brothers. What a picture that must have been. I could imagine that picture would have made it into the photo book of David's life. And then it says, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Well, Samuel goes home, and David goes back to the pasture. Imagine what that must have been like for David. Put yourself in David's sandals for just a moment. Samuel, this highly respected, famous prophet, the spiritual leader of Israel, has told you that God has chosen you to be king of this nation. And then he pours oil over your head to signify that. You feel it running down your hair, running down your neck. And the Spirit of the Lord comes powerfully upon you. What do you think should happen the very next morning? Well, I wonder if he thought, maybe I'll go to this king leadership training school and that's where I'm going to be heading off. Or maybe they'll take me to Shop Royale and I'll try on these crowns and these robes. But no, David goes back to the pasture to do the boring, everyday shepherd stuff. And maybe in his free time, he does target practice with his slingshot. He writes some songs, but there's nothing exciting about his life. And during these years in the pasture, and there will be a few of them before we see David again, I have to wonder, did David question, Lord, did you forget? Did you make a mistake? I thought I was supposed to be the king. No mistake. No mistake, David. One day you will see the purpose behind all of this. And God uses that time for David in the pasture to prepare him to become the king. During that obscurity, during the monotony of this everyday boring life, God builds into David skill, patience, endurance. He builds character and he keeps David's heart growing to be one that is just completely devoted to him. And most importantly, it was in the pasture that David discovers God. He discovers him in the solitude, in the quietness of that place. He gets to know him as the good shepherd, so that one day he would write from experience a psalm that would comfort people for millennium to come with words like this: "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right path for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." God trained David in the pasture. In 1 Chronicles 17, verse 7, God says to David through the prophet Nathan, we read this week in the story, I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people, Israel. Listen to this. I have been with you where you have gone. And David had come to know of God's presence in the pasture. And I think God does the same thing with us during times that we feel like we're just in the pasture. During the monotonous seasons of life, where the snapshots, the photos of that time don't make it into the photo book. Moms of little ones, what did you do this week? I can hear some of you whisper, changed a bunch of diapers, fed babies, wiped runny noses. That's about all I did. And I would like to say to you that I think God says, allow me to care for you while you are caring for these precious little babies. You are helping to love and nurture and care for the future generation. You are shaping them, even if it feels like you're in the pasture. Teachers, how about you? Well, I taught some multiplication tables. Did the kids appreciate it? Are you kidding? All that multiplied was their bad attitudes. And I believe God would say to you, allow me to teach you. Get to know my patience, get to know my kindness, and use each day to pass that on to the kids who right now are just plain bratty. You see, I have a different plan for them, and actually, right now, this year, you are a part of that plan that has the potential to change the trajectory of their lives. Hey, business professional, what did you do? Oh, I settled some accounts, I sold some stuff, I met some clients. Pretty boring, nothing exciting. Well, in the monotony of your pasture, get to know God's ultimate provider. As the ultimate provider, ask Him for a vision for how your business can do more than just earn money, but maybe make a difference in your city or even on the other side of the world. And listen for that. Listen for Him to give you a vision. Hey, student, what did you do? Oh, I studied some lame stuff in history and calculus that I'm never going to use. God might say, I know it seems like a waste, but keep going, because from my perspective, these boring days in class are not a waste. If you allow me, I'm going to use this time in your life to teach you perseverance, and trust me, you are going to need perseverance all throughout your life. Hey, retiree, you might feel like you're overlooked, that you're back in the pasture, that the best of your life is over. But God might say, in my perspective, you have so much to offer. It is far from over. Your knowledge, your experience is needed. All you have learned along the way in your journey with me needs to be shared with others. The future needs you. Life is full of monotony. Each day doesn't make it into the photo book, but the reality is God is at work in all of it. He was at work in David, getting him ready for the future, and He's at work in us during our times in what feels like the pasture. So don't waste your pasture. If you are living that pasture experience right now, don't despise it. David could not have become who he was without it, and neither can we. If you're taking notes on your app or just on the paper, the first learning to walk away with from this part of David's photo book is this: don't waste your pasture. Well, we now turn a few pages over in David's photo book to a place called the Valley of Elah. Now, that name may not be familiar to you, but I bet you know the story that happened right in that place. We visited the Valley of Elah on Riverwood's tour of Israel. It was the first place we went to. The bus stopped on the side of the road. We all piled out, and we looked at this valley, and we tried to imagine the story that is so very familiar. Let's picture it as we read 1 Samuel 17, verse 2. And it's on page 147 of the story. It says, Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah, and they drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites another, with the valley in between. Who were these Philistines? Well, essentially, they were the bad guys. They were Israel's enemy, and they were an intimidating enemy at that. They were the first civilization to work with metal, and they were therefore more advanced in their weaponry than Israel. Israel didn't really stand a chance against the Philistines. Well, one day, Jesse calls David in from the pasture, and he asks him to go check on his older brothers who are on the front line of this battle. And like any dad, he's concerned about his boys at war. How are they doing? Is everything okay? How is the battle going? David comes, gets this care package that Jesse's put together for the older boys, and heads out to go see his brothers. He gets to the camp and he goes straight to them. But whom should he see there? Whom should he hear? A loud-mouthed, patronizing, oversized man, a giant in every sense of the word. His name is Goliath. For 40 days, this overpowering, intimidating creature of a man has been taunting the Israelites to send one of their men out to fight him. He was doing this Eastern war tactic that said, send a representative from one army and a representative from the other, fight. Whoever of that fight wins, that army wins. Well, and so far, not one of the experienced, skilled Israelite soldiers had come even close to accepting Goliath's challenge. But when they see him, they actually run away in fear. And then David walks up, and he says, I'll fight him. And Saul replied, you're not going out there, David. You're not going out against those Philistines to fight them. You are only a young man. He's been a warrior since his youth. Oh, I realize that, David says, but you see, I've spent some time in the pasture, and I've learned some things there. In 1 Samuel 17, 34 to 37, page 148 of the story, it says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion and a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. I struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine, he'll be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paws of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. In the pasture, in an extremely monotonous season in David's life, he's learned a really powerful lesson, one that the rest of the men had either forgotten or they hadn't learned it yet. The guys in the army, when they looked at Goliath, they said, look how much bigger he is than us. And David comes along. He looks at Goliath and he says, look how much smaller he is than God. In the pasture, David learned how big God really is. He says, I've gotten to know him as my rescuer. I know that even when I walk through the darkest valley, I don't need to be afraid, not because I'm so brave or so skilled or so experienced, but because God, the all-powerful God, is with me. David lived his life with the mindset that God was bigger than any 9'9" giant warrior. His God was more powerful than the 200 plus pounds of armor and weaponry that Goliath had. What would it be like if we lived our lives with that kind of perspective? Because the reality is, we all face giants. They are of equal proportions to the size of Goliath. We face 9'9" situations that threaten to overwhelm us, threaten to take us down, worries and fears that taunt us, maybe for 40 days or more, both morning and night, that say, you're not going to overcome this one. It's too much. It's too big. It's too powerful. But what is the truth that God followers can hang on to? Our God is bigger. Our God is stronger. Our God is greater. We see that truth all over the Bible. And in 1 John 4:4, it says it outright. For Christ followers, greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world, who seems to have all that power of evil. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. So when you or I face that giant of unemployment, that giant of a relationship that's gone bad, giant of infertility, the giant of cancer, the giant of grief, the giant of that difficult conversation, the giant of that huge work project that you are responsible for, the giant of failure. All of that is small compared to the big God that you and I are invited into relationship with. As a staff, we talk on Tuesday mornings about the story chapter for that week. And I find that it affects us all week long. So many times this week, I heard Todd in the office or even at home say, I faced a giant today and I conquered it. I didn't run away in fear. Instead, I relied on God's strength and I faced it and conquered that giant. And we read in Psalm 59, one of David's Psalms. We saw it in chapter 11 of the story this week. And it said this, you are my strength, David writes. I watch for you. You, God, are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely. I will sing of your strength in the morning. I will sing of your love. You are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. Friends, we need to consistently get into the practice of finding the right perspective first thing in the morning before we start our day. Finding a chair in your favorite room, a chair where you would go to every morning and you would spend 15 minutes there getting the right perspective, where you would pick up chapter 12 for this week and maybe you would just read a few pages each day and allow God to speak to you. Allow him to give you the perspective that you need for that day, to watch for him, to rely on him, and like David, pray, Lord, I'm facing a huge giant today, but I will sing of your strength in the morning. I will sing of your love. You are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. John Ortberg, who's a pastor and an author, writes about Christ followers and how they too often shrink God. He says this, when human beings shrink God, they offer prayer without faith, work without passion, service without joy, suffering without hope, and it results in fear, in retreat, in loss of vision, and failure to persevere. Instead of shrinking God, let's do what David did. Let's see God for how big he really is. In Psalm 34, verse 3, it says, "Magnify the Lord with me. Make him big. Exalt his name forever, because he is all-powerful." The second takeaway from the photo book of David's life is this: be God-focused, not giant-focused. David trusts his big God, and he faces that big giant, and he says in 1 Samuel 17:45-47, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And then he says, the battle belongs to the Lord. And David runs toward that battle line. He reaches into his pocket. He pulls out a stone. He starts whirling around his sling, and he goes faster and faster and faster, and the stone flies toward Goliath's forehead. Much to everyone's surprise, it knocks him out. Really? This big 9'9" giant knocked out by this tiny little stone? Goliath was defeated. From the valley of Elah, from that snapshot in the photo book, we learn the importance of being God-focused instead of giant-focused. Romans 8:35-39 in the New Testament talks about all sorts of giants, and it lists them: troubles, calamity, danger, hunger. And then it says this: despite all these things, overwhelming victory is ours through Christ who loved us. And because we can be confident in God's love for us, we don't need to waste our pasture. And because of his great power, we can focus on God instead of focusing on that giant in front of us. Well, as we skip over a bunch of other pages, we get to the photo book of David's page in the photo book of David's life, where I would write this caption: "Let little sins bother you." Let me paint a bit of the picture here for that. At this point, David has been on the run for 4 years. He's still not reigning as king. In fact, it's a total of 15 years between the time that Samuel anoints him as king to the time that he actually reigns as king. 15 years. That is a really long time. And he comes and he gets to this point, and he's running away from this crazy King Saul. And you see, David's popularity had been increasing among the people. Jealousy had begun to take root in Saul's soul, and it grew, and because he wasn't surrendering his life to God, because he wasn't confessing that little sin of jealousy, it had this chance to grow, and God allowed a tormenting spirit to have access to him. And Saul became absolutely delusional, and all that mattered to him now was getting David right out of the picture. And so David is hiding. He's on the run. He's in a place called En-Gedi. It's an oasis in the desert, a place of relief and refreshment for any weary traveler due to its water springs and its vegetation. And it was a great place to hide, as there are caves all over. And as we walked around En-Gedi when we were in Israel, I could almost imagine David there on the hunt, looking for the best place to hide, the best cave to be in. Well, Saul's spies find out where David is, and Saul walks into the very cave where they are hiding. It's all dark. He doesn't see them. He takes off his robe, he lays it on a rock, and he begins to do his business. He's going to the bathroom with these 600 eyes peering out at him. David and his guys are at the back of the cave, and they whisper to David, "David, this is your chance. We can end the craziness right here, right now. This is a God thing. So David takes his sword and he begins to crawl towards Saul. The men are excited. They've been on the run for so long. They've been hunted. And now it was all going to be over. They would be able to go to the royal palace where there would be food and beds and baths and comfort. They would be getting their lives back after this moment. All the wrongs that were done to David, all the betrayal, all the insults, all the injustices, they're about to be settled right now in this cave. David reaches the rock. He gets a piece of the robe and he cuts off the corner of it. And he crawls back to his men. And they're like, David, what the heck? Why didn't you kill him? And it says in 1 Samuel 24, 5-7, afterward, David was conscience-stricken. For having cut off a corner of his robe, he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him. For he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and was on his way. David was conscience-stricken. Those words stuck out to me this week. Conscience-stricken. You see, David was a man after God's own heart. He was a man of integrity. Right after he cut the corner of Saul's robe, which was something that he knew dishonored the king in power, he realized that he not only cut a corner of material, but he was cutting corners spiritually. The little, seemingly inconsequential sin would dishonor God's timing, would dishonor God's man still in power. He would be taking matters into his own hands instead of leaving the situation in God's hands. He would be repaying evil for evil. And God would have none of that. If Romans 12:17 was written at the time, David probably would have been quoting it. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Both David's example of being conscience-stricken and this Romans 12:17 verse, I believe is for us today. Let's not cut corners. Let's be people who honor God and honor others by the way we choose to live. You know, nobody sets out to commit those big sins. You know, the ones where we lose our reputation, where we lose our families, where we lose our careers. Nobody wants to become addicted to something. Nobody wants to have this failure printed all over about what they have done. But I can guarantee you, it's not the big stuff that happens overnight. It's the little lines that were crossed, the compromises made, the corners that were cut. And all of those big sins started when somebody stopped being bothered by the little sins. Let little sins bother you. Let's not cut corners spiritually. Let's not stop getting our perspective from God's word. Let's not stop talking to him and getting strength from him. Let's not stop gathering together as a faith community to be encouraged, to be challenged. Let's not cut corners. Well, David ends up being king of Israel in God's time, the right time, when he's 30 years old. It was quite a journey to this place, one that we can learn a lot from. So this week, if you feel like you're walking into the pasture again, to the monotony, the boringness, the same old, same old. Ask God, what do you want me to learn in the pasture this week? And if you're facing a giant, 1, 5, maybe 10 giants this week, as you open your door to go to work tomorrow morning, to go to school, let's remember that truth, that our God is greater. Be God-focused, not giant-focused. And when temptations come, and they will, when they come, let's remember to not cut corners and to let the little sins bother us. Let's pray. God, I thank you that the life of David was recorded in your book for us to learn from. There's so much that we can glean from your word, and help us this week to put that into practice, to not waste our pasture, to focus on you instead of focusing on that giant this week. And help us to be so sensitive to your Spirit that we allow the little sins to bother us. We need your help, God. We need your strength. In Jesus' name, amen.